In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a web application using Spring Boot. What we are going to do is we're going to put data into a H2 in-memory database and then use Spring Framework, Spring Data JPA, Spring Boot to pull that data out of the database and display it on a web page. And I'm going to take you through this step by step. If you are brand new to Spring Boot, this is a perfect video for you to get started. If you just want to get some experience to see how Spring and the different Spring Framework projects can be used together to display data on a web page, and this is a perfect video for you. It is geared for people that are brand new to Spring, and this is actually a collection of lessons from a Udemy course that is available for free. It's a free course, and I will leave a link to that course where you can optionally go enroll. And in that course, I have links to all the source code. So I do something unique, and for each lesson, I give you a beginning and ending branch, so you can see exactly what was changed in the source code. So you'll get links to GitHub where you can see all the source code and exactly what changed between each lesson. So pretty helpful if you're following along and your code isn't working. Now you have something to compare against where you can see exactly what was changed. So I'm going to let you get in. This content is about 2 hours long, and like I said, it's going to take you step by step. We'll start off with creating a Spring project directly from start.spring.io and get you to the point where you can actually display data from a database on a web page using Spring Boot. All right, in this section of the course, what we are going to do is we're going to go in and build a functional web application using Spring Framework. So we're going to cover a lot of ground in this section. And I want to go back when I first started getting introduced to Spring and Hibernate and Java and all that stuff. I had a mentor early on in my career. It was a guy from Russia, spoke with a real thick accent, but one of the smartest guys I ever worked with. And at that point in time, I was a junior developer, so I was pretty fresh to Java. I knew SQL pretty good, knew some technology, but I was a pretty early developer at that point in time. And we took an early version of Spring. We used Hibernate, and I watched this guy work, and he was just very, very skilled, very comfortable with the tools. And we built a web application in an afternoon that was actually functional and had some really cool functionality. And at that time in my career, I was blown away. I was like, wow, this guy created this whole application. He just did this. He knew exactly where to go to fret and that and that. And it just all came together and it worked. So that's what we're going to do. That's what I want to accomplish in this section of the course. It's going to be a very quick overview of Spring. And what I want to show you is how we can use Spring in a very productive way, how Spring is going to save us time to build a web application. And by web application, what we're going to do is we are going to be generating HTML with dynamic content from a database. So we'll be using an in-memory database. We'll be using Hibernate. We'll be using Spring Data JPA. And we will be configuring everything so that we can display some data from the database onto a web page. And we will go through this step by step, but I do want to set some expectations. I'm going to show you how to use this stuff, but I'm not going to be going into a lot of depth. So we are going to kind of go broad in this, show you a lot of stuff, and get a functional web application because I want you to see just how easy it is. I'm not going to explain everything fully in detail. We got a lot of content in this course, so I'm going to give you a broad picture of how easy it is. And we have entire chapters on some of this stuff coming up in the course where we will go deep, but here we're going to kind of go broad, get you a broad understanding of what we can do with the Spring Framework. And then some of the stuff that you have questions about, we will definitely be going deeper and explaining those and exploring those more coming up in the course. So here we're going to have a lot of fun. I will be going step by step, and you're going to see just how easy it is, how quickly we can build a functional web application using the Spring Framework. So we'll be bringing tools together, Spring Framework, Spring Boot, Spring MVC, Spring Data JPA, which has Hibernate in it. We'll use an H2 in-memory database. So we're going to bring a lot of these technologies together quickly, and you'll see just how easy it is to build a functional web application using these technologies. And let's go over and get started building our first web application using the Spring Framework. In this video, I'm going to show you just how easy it is to create a Spring Framework project. Now, in my early days with the Spring Framework, and this is going back a few years, unfortunately. The Spring framework has been around for a long time. And when I started using the Spring framework, I think it was around version 2, if I remember right, we did not have anything like Spring Initializer. Everything you had to do would be hand-rolled. So you'd have to go through and create a brand new Maven project, go out and research the stack of dependencies that you needed to bring into the project to wire up these different Spring components. What Spring Initializer does is it goes out and gives you common options for common things that you're going to be bringing in. So you might want to have like Thymeleaf being brought into your project. You're going to do a Spring Web project. These are all sets of dependencies that we can wire up with the Spring Initializer. And what it's going to do is form up the project and give you options to bring down either a Maven build or a Gradle build and assemble a project for you. And in just a few mouse clicks, you can effectively do what would take me back 10, 15 years ago, an afternoon of research and assembling all these dependencies. So this is just such a huge time saver to have this type of technology now. It's really amazing, especially for me, coming from the old days where you had to do all this manually. So you guys are going to be a little bit spoiled. So let's jump over and take a look at the Spring Initializer project on GitHub and talk more about its capabilities. Spring Initializer is an open source project, of course, and you can see the project up here on GitHub. If you want to go and review the project yourself, actually, I just found it by Googling Spring Initializer, and they do spell it funny without an E between the Z and the R. I think that's possibly a European thing to spell it that way. In the States, we use an E there. But here is the project, and if you come down to the README, you can get a little information about the project itself and what's in there, the different modules. But the main thing you're going to be interested in is generating a project. And there's actually several different techniques that you can do to generate a project. You can check this out, run it locally. You can run curl commands against start.spring.io to download this. And there's a number of different parameters. And I'm not going to get into how to use this from the command line. That's a little beyond the scope that I want to do. We will take a look at the web interface, but the primary takeaway that I wanted you to get away from this is that there is an open source project behind it. You can use it programmatically or go to the website and use it. A lot of the IDEs do have an integration, so they kind of abstract that for you, which is nice. Or you can go to start.spring.io, and we'll be taking a look at that specifically in an upcoming segment of this lesson. Now, one of the core things behind Spring Initializer are the Spring Boot starters. Spring Boot starters are basically a curated set of dependencies, and we'll be talking about this throughout the course, this curated set of dependencies. Very, very powerful concept. So if you remember, I said in the beginning when I had to do all this manually, what Spring is giving us are basically Maven bombs that give us a bill of material, a set of known components that work together. Like if we want to bring in JMS messaging into our Spring application, we would include a dependency on this Spring Boot starter, and it would bring in the different components that I would need to connect to that particular flavor of JMS. So what I'm going to do now is jump over to the browser and take a look at some of these dependencies and show you how they work as to how Spring is organizing these and the number of different dependencies that you can bring in. Because Java is such a large community, you do have a number of options to select from. Okay, you can see on my screen here that I do have GitHub up. And this is the Spring Boot project, and you can see I'm in the subdirectory for Spring Boot starters. Now, all these here are different starters that are available. So we have ActiveMQ, AMQP, different cloud connectors, JDBC, Solar, FreeMarker. So you can see a lot of very common, popular open source projects. So let's come in here and take a look at the ActiveMQ one here. And this is just a Maven POM. And let's take a look at this POM, and you can see in here, this has dependencies listed. So this is saying that I need the Spring Boot starter. I also need Spring JMS, and I need an ActiveMQ broker, and they're doing an exclusion there, as well as Jakarta JMS. So this brings in implementation of the JMS API. And these are the different dependencies that you would need to bring up an ActiveMQ messaging. So this is a very nice thing. Without this, what we'd have to do is include all these into our dependencies. So what's going to be happening is this works with the Maven dependency management to bring these libraries into our project for us and make these dependencies. So just by including this dependency in, we get all these other dependencies. So if you're a little confused on how dependencies work within a Maven environment, I do have an entire course on Maven, and we will be talking about more in this course, but in that other course, I do dive into this deeply. The main takeaway here is to understand that we do have what is called a bill of materials, and the Spring Boot Starter brings in the different components that we are going to be working with for our Spring Framework project. If you ever watch Josh Long speak, who is a developer advocate for Pivotal, who promotes the Spring Framework to developers talking all over the world, his favorite website in the world is start.spring.io. This is the website that is hosted by Pivotal for us to use to go and create Spring Framework projects. It's a very nice website. And underneath the covers, what's happening there is, remember in that first segment of this lesson, we looked at Spring Initializer. This is just a web front end on Spring Initializer. So it is a web application that we can use and select the components that we want in our Spring Boot project, the components being the Spring Boot starters that we want to include. And this is going to give us an artifact, a zip file, all zipped up of a starter project for us to start developing on with the pre-configured dependencies based on our selections. So let's go over to the web and take a look at start.spring.io. Okay, you can see up on the screen, I have navigated to start.spring.io, Josh Long's favorite website in the entire world. So let's take a look at some of the features of this website. And just as a caveat, this is the latest edition of the website, circa December 2019. As you progress in the course, you will see some older versions. I'm trying to update those videos, but I haven't quite gotten to it yet. And this may change in the future as well. They've actually been evolving this UI quite a bit, and they've made some really nice changes to it. So let's take a look at some of the features. Right at the top here, you do have some links, and you do have an option to toggle dark UI and light UI. And then you can jump to GitHub. We already looked at that, Twitter, or different help options. Now, the project generation, you have an option of a Maven project and a Gradle project. We'll primarily stick with Maven for right now as our build tool. You do have language options for Java, Kotlin, and Groovy. We will be sticking with Java. Now you can see the different versions of Spring Boot that are available for us to use in this tool. For purpose of this course, do not use the snapshot versions. I would pick Spring Boot 2.2 or higher. That's what we'll be focusing on as much as possible in the course. And then here you have a section on project metadata. So you have the group, artifact, and then options. I think by default that's going to be collapsed like that. So you can expand that out and set up a name for your project description, default package name, and then also if you want packaging of jar or war, we will be focusing on using the executable jars in this course. So a nice feature of Spring Boot. We'll be talking about that as we get further into the course. Java versions. A lot of companies are still on Java 8. Most of this course is on originally developed on Java 8. Java 11 is starting to be adopted. I will be starting to move forward with Java 11 and updating the course to Java 11. Java 13, I am not going to be using that release. Java 11 is a long-term support release, so I will be focusing on supporting the LTS releases of Java. If you want to use Java 13, you're probably safe, but I will not be talking about any Java 13 specific features. I'll only update to the LTS releases of Java. Now, dependencies. Here you can come down, you can do a search. You can do things like, let's do like Rabbit. So you can see here it brings up different options for Rabbit, primarily Spring for Rabbit MQ. And if you think of a major open source project, you can type that in and search on it. Or you have the option to come in here and click on this list. And now you can see all these different things. And behind these are Spring Boot Starter or a set of Spring Boot starters. And here you can see development tools. Lombok will definitely be playing with that coming up in the course. Web, reactive. Then you have different template engines, security, SQL, NoSQL, messaging. So you can see there's a lot of options, a lot of different things that we can do with the Spring Framework. And obviously we are not going to be covering each and every one of these options. We'll be using a very small set of these. But there are a number of pre-configured options for working with Spring Framework projects. Obviously Spring is very, very popular, so there's a lot of options that we can utilize. What we're going to be doing in this section of the course is just building a simple web application, and we'll start talking about that in the next section of the course. So a lot of options there inside of Spring Initializer. I imagine it can be a little bit overwhelming. Don't worry, we are going to start off with something very small and very simple just to get our feet wet with the Spring framework. So what I want to do is build a very simple web application in this section of the course. So we're going to jump over to Spring Initializer and grab the dependencies and the starters that we need to do just a simple web application. And by a web application, I want to be able to build a web page and have it back with the database and get data out of the database. So nothing earth-shattering to do there, but we're going to go through it step by step and use Spring Initializer to create that initial project for us. And what I'm going to show you, it really literally took me at least a half a day to do back before we had the Spring Initializer tool. Okay, I'm back at start.spring.io. So I'm going to come in here and create our project. I want a Maven project. I want Java. And then let's do 2.2.2. That is the most current example. And I'm going to name my group guru. Remember, that is just a common Java convention to use the reverse of your domain name for the group. And let's call this Spring 5 Web App, like so. And let's look at the options, Spring 5 Web App. And we'll say simple web application. And the package name is defaulting to the group ID and the name of the application. So that's perfectly fine with me. We are going to stick with an executable jar. And then let's take this to Java 11. If you have Java 8 installed, go ahead and use Java 8. Probably won't get into any Java 11 specific features. And let's see here. Let's expand out the dependencies, make this a little bit easier on ourselves. So we're not going to need any developer tools. We do want Spring Web. So that is going to bring in Spring MVC. And let's come down here and let's come down to SQL. We are going to be working with Spring Data JPA to make our lives a lot easier. So we'll add that in. The only other thing I want to bring in is the H2 database. This is going to give us an in-memory database. And that is all my selections. So you can see here, we've got 3 selected. Just going to double check. Okay, so let's go ahead and I'm going to say generate. Click on this generate tab right here down at the bottom. And you can see, if you look at the bottom of my screen, it has brought down a zip file. So this zip file contains a pre-configured project for us. So you can see how easy it was to generate a Spring Framework project. Going over to start.spring.io, just a few mouse clicks and a little bit of typing, I was able to generate my project. So I brought down that zip file. Inside that zip file is a fully functional Spring Framework project using the Maven build tool. I think if memory serves me right, all you would need to have is Java installed on your system. It does come with Maven wrapper, so you could use the shell script to actually execute this on a system that does not have Maven installed, but only has Java installed. So this is very simple. This literally is a huge time saver compared to doing all these steps manually. So let's go over and take a look at what's inside that zip file, what the Spring Initializer provided us for our Spring Web project. Okay, you can see that I've gone into my downloads directory, and here on the screen I've opened up the Spring 5 Web app, and you can see this is all the files that were inside that zip file. Any zip utility will open this file just fine for you. I have a git ignore, and here's a .maven, so this is where the Maven wrapper is. A little help markdown file, and then 2 files here, Maven W, that is for POSIX systems, so if you're on OS X or Mac OS now, I keep calling it OS X, that is the file that you'd want to run, Linux as well, or Windows, you'd want the command file to execute that and then run Maven for you. We can see here I have a Maven POM file. We'll be taking a look at that coming up in a different video. And then here we have a source folder. This is the Maven standard project layout, source main. Then I have Java. And then you can see here's my package. That is the package that we entered in, a Java class. And then also here we get a project directory. These are resources, so we have application properties. And if we had any templates we'd put there, or static web resources, and it generated those because we selected the web project, so it gave us those directories. And then also here we have tests, so this under test, and again we have the standard project, and then a stub of a test class. So this is all the stuff that was in that file. We'll take a look at these, what's the contents of these files once we get it into IntelliJ. give us a little easier time to discuss the two Java classes. One is the main class, and then the other is a test class, and we'll take a look at those, as well as the Maven dependencies that are being brought into the project in an upcoming video. So let's go ahead and take a look at the project inside of IntelliJ that we brought down from Spring Initializer. So I'm going to come in here to IntelliJ, and let's come up here. We're going to do File, and I'm going to say Project from Existing Sources. And what I've done is I took that zip file, I moved it into a temp folder, and you can put that in a workspace that you're comfortable with. Here I'm just demonstrating this, so I'm going to go through and open up the Spring 5 web app. And I'm going to click on the POM file, and here I am going to say open. And what's happening is IntelliJ is now importing the project. This takes a second. It's going to go through, scan the project, bring down any dependencies, and down on the bottom you'll see some flashing going by. And let me resize this a little bit. So now we can see here we have the Spring 5 web app. And let's open up this POM file. So there's a lot of important things that are happening here. So the way Maven dependencies are going to work is it's going to inherit from the Spring Boot parent. Now, if I come in and hold down the Command key under OS X, I think Control for Windows. I could be wrong on that since I don't normally use Windows. And then click, this will take us into the Spring Boot starter parent. And you can see here, this is setting up a number of resources for us and different plugins, which we really don't need. But the more important one is that it's going to come here to Spring Boot dependencies. So this is going to be bringing in a lot of common properties. So you can see there's literally hundreds of versions being maintained for us. So this is what's called curated dependencies. This is all being maintained by the Spring team. And now you can see this dependency management. So this is a real quick tip as we're working with Spring Boot when you bring in dependencies. And these are all curated dependencies. So when we have this in dependency management, if I wanted to grab this artifact in, I just bring in the artifact into my upper level BOM since it's in the dependency management, and I just include that. And then I can emit the release and allow this to manage the release. So that's actually a best practice. And this is something I talk about more in depth in my Maven course. So we really go into this a lot in depth, but just be aware of how we are inheriting dependency information from the Spring Boot parent POM and the dependencies POM. So let me close this and take a closer look at what it gave us. So remember we said we gave it a group ID, so you can see goober.springframework there. The artifact Spring 5 web app starts off with a version of 001 snapshot. Name, remember I gave it simple application. It looks like I must have misspelled that in the previous video. Oops, that does happen occasionally. And you can see properties Java 11. And now here's our dependency. So we have the Spring Boot Starter JPA, the Spring Boot Starter Web, and then the H2 database. And then also it brings in the Spring Boot Starter Test. And this is emitting the vintage engine. So that is something that we're going to need if we want to bring in JUnit 4 test. And here you can see I made a change to the POM, and Maven is asking if I want to import the changes. So it's a white space change, but I'm going to click on Enable Auto Import just to keep that happy. That used to be problematic on larger projects, but it's actually pretty decent to just go ahead and allow it to automatically import. So let's come over here. I'm going to expand out this Maven tab. And now we can see here's our Spring Boot app. And I want to look at these dependencies. So let's take a look at the Spring Boot Starter Web. And here you can see it's bringing in the Spring Boot Starter. That has dependencies. So you can see here, so you have Spring Boot, that's bringing in Spring Core. So all this stuff, you used to have to go out and figure out what dependencies you needed to include in your project to get a functional Spring application. So these are all common sense stuff that we can bring in. If we wanted to omit one, we can say excludes, but so far we're going to not be doing that specifically. And so that was the Spring Boot Starter Web. Here's the Spring Boot Starter Data. This brings in AOP, JDBC, Jakarta, Persistence, Hibernate, so bringing in a version of Hibernate, Spring Data JPA. So you can see this bring in a variety of stuff. And sometimes they do duplicate the dependencies because you don't always use these together. So the Spring Boot starter has dependencies saying, hey, I need this. And when you see omitted for duplicate, that means that another dependency is asked for the same one. So let's collapse that. And then the other thing we want to take a look at is the Spring Boot test. So you can see here, this is bringing in a number of things for testing. So I have an entire course on testing Spring Boot. We look at this a lot closer, but these are a lot of testing tools, and we get these included in our project for free. So we get like Mockito and Hamcrust matchers, Assert J, that's some really cool stuff. And of course, JUnit as well. So clearly the way Spring Boot and Spring Initializer set up these initial dependencies is very important because we're going to be relying on these libraries for our project. So let's go ahead and collapse the Maven tab now. And let's take a look at what we got for source code. So under source main Java, and let me change this property here. That just compacts middle packages so I don't have to click through everything. So here's the main class. So this is the main Spring Boot application. So remember, every Java application has a main class. So this is our entry point, and this is just going to start up a Spring Boot web application. So we will get into this in a lot more detail, but standard Java main class. And then finally here, if I come into test, we also get Spring Boot test. So this is a very simple JUnit 5 test. And what this is going to do is bring up the Spring context. Again, that's a new term. We will be looking at that in upcoming lessons in the course. But the primary thing is it provides us a application, a main class, and then a test, and it's going to make sure that context actually does load the Spring context. So very, very simple, but a very simple starting point for us to start developing from. And then finally here, this help MD, this markdown document, can see here, this is going to have additional content in it. This is something that Spring just recently started doing. So when you go through and generate a project with Spring Initializer, it generates the links to help documentation for the projects, the Spring Boot starters that you selected inside of your course. So pretty cool little feature, handy if you need to go in and look up something quickly for the documentation. And then finally, one other thing that it does include is a git ignore. I personally have my own favorite git ignore files, and you'll see me using those on upcoming projects. So I think this is a nice little starter, but you can definitely expand upon the git ignore so you don't get things that you don't want included into your GitHub repository. So always helpful to have that within your code base. And then finally, these two files here, that's part of the Maven wrapper. And this here is the magic sauce behind the Maven wrapper. So as you can see, this is really, I can't underemphasize enough how much of a time saver this is, because I remember setting up Spring projects. You'd start off writing this POM, start researching which dependencies you'd have to bring in. You didn't have this one handy dependency that would bring everything in that you need for a web application. You'd have to go out and find out, oh, I need Spring MVC. Oh, I need Spring AOP. Oh, I'm doing data. I need JPA, I need the transaction jar. So a lot of different libraries that this really takes a lot of work from you that you don't have to worry about. And then also, I remember setting up projects where you have to type out create a directory source, create a directory main, create a directory Java. So this is all time-saving stuff that we get for free by using the Spring Initializer. Okay, in this video, I have an assignment for you. That is create a new Spring Framework project. So what I want you to do is use Spring Initializer to create a brand new project. We want to get this downloaded into a zip file. So go on out to goodoldstart.spring.io. Remember, it's Josh Long's favorite website in the entire world. And what we want to do is use Spring 2.2 or higher. So at the time of recording, 2.2 is the highest release out right now. They are always updating it, so throughout the year, they're going to be releasing updates. So if something's newer, go ahead and grab that. Use Maven and Java 11. If you're limited to Java 8, should be okay. I'm not going to be using any Java 11 features in this section of the course, so don't worry about that. And then to the project, let's add in Spring Web, Spring Data JPA, and an H2 database. So this will be the foundation for the web application that we're going to be building going forward. So go ahead and create this project using Spring Initializer. And in the next video, I will show you how I accomplished this task using Spring Initializer to create a brand new Spring Framework project. Okay, in this video, I'm going to go through the assignment, but I'm going to throw a little twist on it. And what you'll find me doing in the course is I will go through the coding assignments and the reviews of the assignments, and I do take them as educational opportunities. So I do like to show you a lot of new things. And I think I'm going to think that you guys are pretty smart, and we're able to go out to the start.spring.io and successfully create a new Spring Framework project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it from right inside of IntelliJ. So, and this is a feature. All the Spring features of IntelliJ are in the IntelliJ Ultimate Edition. So if you are running Community Edition, you won't be able to do this. So you'll have to go out to start.spring.io and do this. But with the Ultimate Edition, if you come in and come up here and say New Project, I'm going to just say Project here. Remember, we imported the project using from existing sources and pointed it to the POM file. So here I'm going to say New Project, and I'm going to say Spring Initializer, and you can see I have the project JDK there. I'm going to say Next, and what this is doing, this is going to be using Spring Initializer over the web behind the scenes. So rather than using the web front end, which you saw previously, I am using IntelliJ, which is going to be using the same API calls in the background. And I'm just going to call this Web App. And I want it Maven Project Java, packaging of jar. Remember, these are all the same options that we saw in the web application. And here I'm going to say Java 11, version snapshot is okay. So I'm just going to say IntelliJ app. Now I'll say Next. Artifact contains illegal. Oh, let's see. Guess we can't have capitals there. I just learned something there. I didn't know you couldn't have capitals. I've always done it lowercase by accident, so I can teach an old guy new tricks sometimes, I guess. So I don't need DevTools. We do need Spring Web. And then we want to come over to SQL, and we want Spring Data JPA. And remember all the options that we saw? It looks pretty similar to what we saw when we expanded out the options there. And then we want the H2 database. I'm going to say Next. And here it's asking where to create it. So remember, it's working in that temp directory, so that works out just fine for me. Just double checking this. Now I'm going to go ahead and say Finish. And what it's going to do is go out in the background and download this project and open it up. You can see down at the bottom of the screen, there's a little indexing circle. And let's open this up. It looks like did not pick it up as a Maven project. So right now, sometimes IntelliJ does this incorrectly. It downloaded the application, but you can see here it's not highlighting these. It thinks those are normal directories. So it hasn't picked up that it is Maven project. Sometimes it's kind of weird. Sometimes it does it automatically. Sometimes you'll open up the project and go, hey, is this a Maven project? And sometimes it doesn't do anything. So I haven't figured out a rhyme or reason to it. But if you do open up the POM file, come in here, right click, and you can see here, add as Maven project. So that's what we want to do. We're going to tell IntelliJ, hey, this is a Maven project. So now it adds it in as a Maven project, scans the dependencies, and we should see these change. Now see how the Java folder changed to blue, and that is green. So that is where your main Java classes are. So if I come in here and compact middle packages, which I wish would always stay on. There's got to be a way to do that. So now we can see this is a Spring application, and then also we can come over here, see our Spring Boot test, and now we have a functional, air quotes, Spring Boot application. And again, if you use the web application, I just took a different path. The IntelliJ option, it is a screen from IntelliJ, but it is actually going out calling the very same APIs that web front end at start.spring.io is calling. Okay, I know you guys are excited about getting to write some code around the Spring framework, but first we're going to pause and take a look at our GitHub workflow. Now, I've had a lot of students take this course. I think there's like over 40,000 now that have enrolled through the course. And I get this question a lot about how should I be working with the GitHub repositories. Now, I do have a process that's very helpful for you. GitHub is not a requirement for this course. It is something very helpful for you to have. If you are new to GitHub, check out Appendix A of the course. There's additional videos on that, links to videos. There's a ton of free content on GitHub out there if you're not familiar with GitHub. But in this video, what I'm going to be doing is talking to you about the workflow. There's a specific workflow that can really help you out with the course. So I'm going to jump over to a little video here to talk about the workflow, and you get to see my mad skills with Adobe After Effects, my very first little info video that I've done with After Effects. So hope you enjoy this section, and we will get you up to speed on how to use GitHub to your benefit while you're taking this course. All source code examples for the course are inside of GitHub. I use Git branches for each lesson. Now you're going to get a starting branch, which is the state of the code at the beginning of the lesson. Changes that I make inside the lesson are then saved to an ending branch. You will find links to both branches in the course resources. Using branches like this has two big benefits. First, I can go back and update for any errors or new releases of Spring. Second, you can compare your work to my branches. To make comparisons easier, I recommend people use this workflow. First, fork my repository to your own GitHub account. GitHub is completely free to use. If you need help with GitHub, check out Appendix A of this course for a collection of videos about how to use GitHub. Once you have forked my repository to your account, check out your fork from your GitHub account to your own local workspace. Start with the master branch and then follow along the coding exercises in the course. The hands-on coding will help you learn and absorb the material in the course. If you have any problems, you can do a comparison from your own local workspace to the relevant branches inside of my GitHub repository. This will help you identify any differences. Also, by having your own repository, you can share this with others if you run into any problems and need help, or you can also show this to future employers to show them your work. Now, if you're uncertain about these steps, don't worry. In the remainder of this video, I'm going to show you each step, step by step. So the first thing we want to do in our workflow process is to fork my repository to your own GitHub account. So your GitHub account is completely free. If you don't have one, it only takes a minute to sign up. And I'm going to jump over to Chrome and show you exactly how to fork my repository to your own GitHub account. Okay, forking a repository is very simple to do. I am signed into a different GitHub account. This is a very old account that I had, and simulating what you would do. So I am at the Spring Framework GUI repository, but on a different GitHub account. So this is exactly what you would be to do. To fork it, all I have to do is come up here and click on Fork. And it asks me, where do I want to go? I'm going to say right there. And it only takes a few seconds. You can see that it's saying that it's forking. We get this little icon here. And now this is forked into my GitHub repository. And you can see here that it knows that it's been forked. So it says that it's coming from here. So if you ever want to go back to my repository from your own GitHub repository, just simply click on this and you'll see that get back to the original source, which is my repository. But here, this is a repository that you will be using for the course. Okay, the next step in the process is to clone the repository or check it out of GitHub. So I'm going to go through and show you exactly how to do this now. Now, cloning the repository is also a very simple process. So I'm still in my other GitHub account, and this is where I forked to. I'm going to come up here and say clone. Just clicking this copies the URL over to the clipboard. And you do have an option of HTTPS or SSH. I like SSH in a POSIX environment, being Mac OS or Linux. If you're on Windows, HTTPS is probably going to generally work out better for you. And I'm going to jump over. I'm going to show you two different ways that we can clone. First way, we can just come over to the command line. And this assumes that you do have Git installed on your machine. So change to the directory that you wish to be working in for your workspace. And all I got to do is issue the command git clone and then paste in that URL, hit enter, and you can see that git has gone and cloned that repository. If I do a directory here, you can see there's that Spring app, and then there's the working files within it. So now I'm ready to start developing on this. The second way to clone out of GitHub is you can do it right from IntelliJ. So let me toggle over to IntelliJ and show you that now. So here I am in IntelliJ. Just come up to File, New, Project from Version Control. And I'm going to go ahead and paste that. And let's call this 2. I think I already have one in that temp directory. So let's go ahead and clone it. And it's going to say yes. Now, when it first opens it up, it might not detect that it is a Maven project. And IntelliJ is a little inconsistent on this. So sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. It might be on the particular flavor of IntelliJ I'm using. If it does not detect it, which it looks like in this example it has not, has it? Actually, it did. So it did pick up that it is a Maven project. If it does not, like I said, that it is a little random. If it is not, just come in here, right-click, and you'll see in here an option to add it as a Maven project. So like I said, it seems to be completely random. Sometimes it picks it up as a Maven project. When I was testing it, it did not. Here it did. So just one of those weird, quirky things that you see now and then. But here, now again, this is now cloned to my local repository, and I'm all ready to start developing against it. So the whole reason we forked the repository to your own and then cloned it is so that you can do comparisons. So being able to compare your state of your code to my different branches that are going to be in there is a very powerful tool. I'm going to go over to IntelliJ now and show you exactly how easy that is to do. Okay, doing a compare is really easy. Just for purposes here, I'm going to go ahead and add a class. And I always like this compact middle packages. Makes things a little bit easier for us. I'm going to come in here. I'm just going to add in foo class because this is just temporary. I'm adding this in just as an example. So we're going to go ahead and air quotes add it to Git. This is a throwaway repository for me just for purposes of this class. So now what I want to do a comparison against GitHub, I come in here, I right click, and the comparison is going to be based on the folder that you are clicking on. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to compare the entire project. I'm clicking on the root of the source folder. Actually, I could do the top level project folder too if I wanted to. So just come down here, click on compare with branch. And if you had any other branches checked out, you would see them here. Origin means that the origin inside of GitHub. So let's go ahead and take a look at, we'll do adding Thymeleaf. That should give us a bunch of changes. So what you can see here, where things are in gray, that means that is not there. So if I just come up here and say book controller, if I click on that, we can see that there is no local resource to compare against. And green, the food job, I added that in to show you here. This only exists in my repository locally. Now here, this one in blue, that means there's differences. So I have the file here and it's not shown. So if I come in here and double click on this, now we can see here, this is saying that that is the remote version and here's my version. So this line has been added. So we're seeing the difference there. And IntelliJ does a real nice job of showing you the differences. So if you do have any differences, if you have something that's not working, now you can go and compare your source code against my source code. Okay, you can see exactly how easy it is to do comparisons against branches inside of GitHub, inside of your own repository. But what happens if I make changes, if I did some type of patch while you're taking the course, since you've forked? Very simple to do. What we can do is tell Git to look at my repository as well. Very simple command to do that. And now when we do this from IntelliJ, you'll be able to do comparisons to your own forked repository and to my repository as well to see if I've changed anything, if I've done any updates to versions or possible bug fixes. So I'm going to show you exactly how to set that up right now inside of IntelliJ. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to add another remote repo to our GitHub configuration locally. So here on the screen, I have the fork that I did. Now what I want to do is I want to grab this guy right here, go into the original repository, and now I want to copy this URL here. Now I'm going to come back over to IntelliJ. And in IntelliJ, I'm going to go into the terminal. Now this terminal location, you just need to do this from the command line. And you want to issue a very, very simple command. Again, you need to have Git installed on your machine. Just do git remote add, and then paste in that value there. Made one mistake there, so I want to do git remote add, and here I'm going to call it SFG repo. I missed the name previously. And then paste in the URL. So I'm going to call that SFG repo for that. And now that is happy. Now if I come up here and I want to do a git fetch. So what this is going to do is, it looks like it's dropping off the screen there. Sorry about that. So I'm going to go out and do a git fetch. I could also do that from a command line, just do git fetch. And that tells Git to go out to the top level repository and pull down new information. Now, if I come in here and I do a git compare with branch, you can see I have origin, and then I have SFG repo. So these are all the branches inside the original repository. So SFG repo is going to be my repository. Origin will be your repository inside of GitHub. So this allows you to see any changes that I've made to the source code since you forked your own repo. Any changes that I made are not going to be pushed to yours. So this is how you can see any changes that are made since you did the fork. In this lesson, we are going to be setting up the JPA model. Now, JPA is Java Persistence API, and basically JPA is what Hibernate is written to. So that is the API specification that Hibernate is written to. Underneath the covers, we will be using Hibernate. Now, the mapping and stuff, I have a whole section in the course on mapping. We're going to go through this fairly quick as far as setting up the JPA entities that we will be using in this section of the course. But keep in mind that there's like entire courses on Hibernate and JPA. We are going to go through and just show you the facts. Now, underneath, we are going to be setting up two POJOs, plain old Java objects, just objects with properties, getters, and setters, so no big mystery there at all. And let me show you the data model. We are going to use a very simple data model. I'm going to jump over and show you what's called an entity relationship diagram. I'm going to be using JPL Studio, kind of neat little tool for mapping things out. And I'm just going to do a demonstration so you can start to envision the data model we are building in this section of the course. Okay, up on the screen here, I have what's called JDL Studio. So this is from the JHipster project. Actually, a pretty cool project. JHipster is way beyond the scope of this course, but I do have a course that utilizes JHipster. Here, what we're doing is just using it for the modeling. So I want to demonstrate what we are going to be building going forward. So we're going to have two POJOs that we're going to work with. One is author, and it's going to have a first name and a last name, and the other is book, and that's just going to have a title and an ISBN. And ISBN is the universal identifier for books that are published, a number that they get like a UPC code. And you can see there right above book, there's the asterisk underscore asterisk. That means this is a many-to-many relationship. So a book is going to have many authors, and an author can have many books. So that's all that means. So we will be setting this up as a many relationship within JPA, and we'll be completing this mapping. But first we need to actually create these as POJOs. Okay, book author, this is a classic diagram example as far as working through entity relationship mappings. What we're going to do now is jump over to IntelliJ, and I'm going to implement these POJOs for us. What we want to do here is go ahead and set up our two POJOs. So you can see on the screen here, readjust this a little bit. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create a new package. And I'll just call this domain. Usually the JPA entities, you either put them in a package called domain or a model. Either is acceptable, and your organization may have a different standard. That's just something that I see roughly in the industry quite often. So let's come in here and we'll create a new Java class. Say author. And this is going to have, say, string. So I have a last name, and then also we'll do a set. And we want to do, and you can see that books does not exist yet. Oh, we definitely don't want that auto import. I can do this. So I've got IntelliJ set up to automatically manage my imports. And in this case, it's misbehaving on me. So let's come in here. I'm going to create a new Java class book. Add that. Then we can come back over here and get rid of this guy. Now our book, that is going to have just a title. So that sets up our POJOs. Now let's come in here. We want to add in a constructor for this. And let's do all properties. And JPA does require a 0 args constructor. So select none. And then also we want to set up getters and setters. And IntelliJ can automatically generate this. So what I've been doing is to bring up this menu and just do Command N. And now I'm just going to say getters and setters. And we want all those. And now we can see that IntelliJ created all this code for us. And let's go in and do the same thing for book. And take all the properties. Oh, I almost forgot to add in authors to this. So let's come back up here. Oh, that's going to be a set. My mistake. So book can have more than one author. Now Command N. We'll do all the properties and then also a no args constructor. And here I'm going to say select none. And then come down here and I'm also going to go in and add in getters and setters. And we want to do all the properties like so. And you can see that we've generated the codes for all the getter and setter. So that is our two POJOs. Very simple setup. And these are the objects that we will be persisting into the database with JPA. Okay, you can see we have a very simple implementation of a couple POJOs. No big mystery there if you're familiar with Java programming language. Now what we need to do is give these ID values. So we are going to make these into JPA entities here in this section. And this is the one thing about JPA. It is an ORM, Object Relational Mapping tool. And always when you get into some type of mapping, typically you're going to see what's called leakage. So here we need to give JPA an identity value to assign to these classes so it knows how to store these into the database and retrieve them from the database. So this is typically what we call it as a leakage, because now we have our pure object model. Now the identity value that is going to be leaking up into our object model. But just making you aware of some of the terminology around here, this is a necessary step that we need to go through as far as configuring the JPA entities to make them entities. So I'm going to jump over to IntelliJ now and show you how to make these POJOs into official, fully fledged JPA entities that can be persisted by Hibernate to a database. So what we want to do in this video is go ahead and make our POJOs into actual official JPA entities. So the first thing that we want to do is annotate the class with the entity annotation. And you can see that is coming out of the Java X persistence package. So now this tells Hibernate that this is an entity, and we can see that this is upset because we don't have a primary key. So what we want to do is come in here, we'll add in a new private property, long. Now the key properties can be several different data types, and we'll talk more about that later in the course. Now what we want to do is annotate this as the ID. Again, that's out of the Java X Persistence package. And we need to tell Hibernate how it's getting generated. So we're going to say strategy, generation type auto. And what this means is that the underlying database is going to be providing the generation of this. So if you're familiar with databases like MySQL, it has an automatic ID generation. So that's what we're saying, is that the property is going to be managed by the database. The database will be assigning that ID. Now, of course, this is a private property, no way to access it. So let's come down here and also add in getters and setters for the ID property. And that completes the author class. Now we need to do the same thing for book. So let's come in here, entity, and annotate that with ID, generated value, and then strategy, generation type auto. And then we also have to come up here. Nope, let's get under the other constructor there. And we will add in a getter and setter for the ID property. So that completes the annotations that are needed to set this up as an official JPA entity. Now what we need to do is assign relationships. So obviously our author can have many books, and books can have more than one author. So we are going to be using what's called a many-to-many relationship. This does get a little tricky to set up. Don't worry if you don't understand everything. I have an entire section on doing mapping coming up in the course, so we will be exploring mappings much more coming up in the course. But here what we want to do is just establish the basic mappings. We'll step through this and show you how to establish a many-to-many relationship between authors and books. Okay, in this video what we want to do is go ahead and define the relationships between books and authors. And we are going to do a many-to-many relationship. So let's come over here to author. And what we want to do is on the books property, we are going to say this is a many-to-many relationship. And we are going to say it's mapped by authors, like so. And we can see that this is not, it's giving us a warning here that that is not completed. And we have to complete the other side of it. So let's come back over to book. And this time it's going to be a little bit more complicated. What we want to do is say at many-to-many. And now what we're going to do is set up what's called a join table. This gets a little complicated, and I do cover this more in an upcoming lesson. So we want to say join table. So underneath in the database, if you can envision, we're going to have a table for author and a table for book. And we are going to use a join table called author book that is going to hold the relationship between records in the author table and records in the book table. And so that's what we are setting up here. Join columns, let's see here. And inverse join column. I know this mapping is probably a little confusing. This is probably one of the hardest ones to map, is this many-to-many relationship. And what this mapping is doing, this is setting up the properties within the join table. And we can see IntelliJ is saying can't find column author ID. So you can see below that assign data sources. What IntelliJ can do is inspect a database, and I don't have it set up for that. So that's why that is complaining. So let's just do a quick recap on this. So here on the author Pojo, I am saying that it has a many-to-many relationship to books, and it is going to be mapped by authors. So here I'm saying mapped by authors. In the book object, I have that property authors, so that is the set. And I also have a many-to-many relationship here. But now here I am saying join table. This configures that join table. So I know we covered a lot in this video here as far as the mapping. Again, I have an entire section on setting up these mappings, and hopefully make that a little more clear here. But this is setting up that the relationships between author and book, and now we'll be able to move forward and start working with these objects within JPA. So remember how I was talking about the object model and the relational model having a little leakage coming up. So one of the things that we need to do, because we have this little bit of leakage here, is implement an equals and hash code method. So this is kind of important because the standard equals and hash code methods that we get by default with Java or Java objects isn't going to suffice for our needs. What we want to do is base equality on the ID of the object. So that ID property that we added, that effectively identifies it to a database record. So we want to go in and modify these methods, or actually override the methods, to provide logic around the ID property, so that if two objects have the same ID, Hibernate and things like sets are going to consider them the same object. So I'm going to jump over to IntelliJ and show you how easy it is to implement these methods inside of IntelliJ. Now, if you're not using IntelliJ, I don't know how other IDEs behave. I'm sure there's an equivalent for something like Eclipse. Worst case, look at the source code that I am implementing here for these methods and just duplicate that. Go ahead and implement the equals method here. So I'm going to grab the author class and scroll down to the bottom of the class. And I'm going to use IntelliJ to do the initial implementation. So I'm just going to do Command N. And you can see the equals and hash code method. Sorry, this is towards the bottom of the screen. And IntelliJ will actually has several different templates. And I'm just going to go in and take the default and not select any of the options here. So this is going to be just fine for our purposes. And I just want to do this. So just do the ID field. And I'm not going to do the other properties, because again, we're going to be setting that up for the ID property to determine object equality. And then we're just going to do the same for the hash code. Say next. And that is not a non-null field, because that could be in null. And I will say finish. And we can see that sets up the equals and hash code function. So that sets that up for the author class. So now it's coming in here and do the same for the book class. Again, just Command N, equals and hash code, IntelliJ default, next. And I just want the ID property like so. Say next, next for that. And finish that. And now we can see that the equals and hash code functions have been implemented, which is exactly what we need for our use case here with Hibernate. Now, one other thing I want to show you how to do is implement a toString method. Now, by default, we do have a toString method on it, and if memory serves me right, we're just going to get the class and object ID, which is for debugging purposes pretty much useless. So it doesn't give you all that much information. What we're going to do here is I'm going to show you how IntelliJ will implement a toString method for us that will display the properties of the object. So it does a nice job for this. And then if we do need to do a toString on one of these objects, we'll actually have useful information in our log or console. So this is a nice little tips and tricks that I like to use with IntelliJ. I imagine Eclipse probably does have something similar to this. I'm really not sure. It's been a long time since I used Eclipse, but I'm going to jump over to IntelliJ now and show you how easy it is to implement a toString method that is actually functional. Yeah, let's go ahead and implement that toString method. You can see here I've got the author up, and I'm going to put this above the equals method. And again, I'm just going to hit Command N, and this is on a Mac. And I want to come down here and say toString, and I'm just hitting enter. And you can see I'm just going to take all the properties there. Now, if I was doing a project there with something sensitive, like a password or a bank account information, I could deselect that pretty easily here. But here, this is just demonstration. We'll go ahead and say select all there and say OK. And here we can see that we are getting this toString method implemented, and we'll get a JSON-like output for the values for the author. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing for the book implementation. We'll come over here. And that's just Command N. And we're going to come down to toString and implement it like that. So now we have a nice functional toString method that will show us the properties of the object if we have to do a toString on it. In this video, we are going to implement Spring Data repositories. Now, Spring Data is really a family of projects. So we're going to be looking at Spring Data JPA specifically, which is made to work with Hibernate. Now, Spring Data is a very cool project and really alleviates a lot of coding that you have to do around database operations. So it implements a repository pattern. It was originally, if I remember correctly, it was originally proposed by Martin Fowler to use data repository. So it's a competing pattern to data access objects, is something you might be familiar if you're used to writing JEE type stuff. Repositories is a slightly different pattern where you have a repository object that is responsible for your persistence and query operations. So I actually, when I first started using it, it was a little foreign to me, but I have grown to like the pattern really from its simplicity, because it is a very simple pattern to implement. And Spring Data JPA, what it is doing underneath the covers is taking care of all the Hibernate commands, all the transactional commands, and just about everything that you have to do normally, because there is a lot of ceremonial code. If you've ever written JDBC code directly, you can understand how much ceremonial code there is. And this really abstracts it. It allows us as developers to go in and just focus on providing business functionality. And we are just going to scratch the surface of the capabilities of Spring Data JPA in this video. Coming up in the course, we are going to get into a lot more to do with Spring Data JPA because it is a very robust project and you get a lot of value out of it. But here we're just going to go through and set up Spring Data JPA repositories for our two books and authors objects. And you're going to be, at the end of the video, you're going to be, that's all I had to do. Yes, that is all you have to do here to get up and going with Spring Data JPA. And in future videos, we will be working more and more with the repositories we set up inside this video. Let's go ahead and implement our repository. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create a new package. I'm just going to call it repositories. And what I want to do is come up here and I'm going to create a new Java class. This is going to be an interface. And I want to say author repository. So, and we will add that into Git for your reference. And we are going to extend CRUD repository. And that takes two generics. The first property is going to be the type, and the second is going to be the ID value. So go ahead and inspect author real quick. And just remember so that we want author, and then we have the long. So the box primitive of long. So let's go ahead and add that now. And that's all we have to do to set up a CRUD repository. Now, what this is going to give us, let's take a quick look at the CRUD repository. So this is going to extend out the repository. From a CRUD repository, we are going to get save all, find by ID, exist by ID, find all, find by ID, account, delete by ID, delete by entity, delete all from a list, and then delete everything in the repository. And this also extends out repository as well, and that doesn't have any specific methods that it's calling for. And what's going to happen at runtime, Spring is going to provide the implementation for this. So we are just providing the interface. Spring Data JPA is going to provide the implementation for us, and it will implement all those methods for us to work with. So let's also set this up for book. So new Java class interface. We'll call this a book repository. And it's going to also extend out CRUD repository. And it's going to be book and long, like so. And we want our book, not out of Java AWT, definitely not that one. And so that will set up the book repository. So at this point, we've done everything we need to configure two repositories for our author entity and our book entity. In this video, we're going to go ahead and set up initialization of some data for our application to work with. So what I'm going to do is come in here and let's add in a new package. I'm going to call that Bootstrap. And for those that don't know, computer booting up is a very common terminology that comes from an old saying. I believe it's from the US, is to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So that's kind of where the origins of that saying are. And I'm going to come in here and add in a new class. I'll just call that Bootstrap Data. Go ahead and add that, and that's going to implement a command line runner. And command line runner, this is an interface that we want to implement. And this is going to tell Spring, Spring is going to look for instances of this type, and when it finds them, it's going to go ahead and run them. So I need to implement a method here, so just hit Command N, implement methods, and it wants to have that run method implemented. And here, what I want to do is mark this as a component. Doing this tells the Spring framework to go ahead and detect this as a Spring managed component. Now I need to use dependency injection. We have a whole section on dependency injection. So what I want to do is I'm going to come in here, private final, and I will say, let's start with the author repository. Just keep this in order. There's author repository and book repository. Like that. And then I'm going to do Command N, constructor, and bring those two in. So that sets up the constructor, and what's going to happen is when Spring implements this component, it's going to bring it into the Spring context. It will do dependency injection into the constructor for an instance of the author repository and also the book repository. So let's go ahead and set up a couple authors and books. So let's do author, and we'll call this guy Eric. And we'll say, and let's see, what am I missing there? Oh, empty set of book. We don't want to do that. So I'm going to modify the author and get rid of the book property. So we're not going to create an author with a set of books. Just go ahead and get rid of that for now. It's going to be a little bit more friendly. And let's create a new book. And I'm curious if anybody knows who Eric Evans is, because I'm about to give it away here. This is a classic book, domain-driven design. And did I do the same thing with book? Let's go in and take a look at that. Yeah, we don't want to have the set property there, so just doing a little refactoring of our objects here so we don't have to initialize books and authors for us. Let's go back over to the Bootstrap and finish that up. Now that is going to set up a book by that, and what we want to do is add in a book to the author and an author to the book. And by removing the constructor did cause one problem there. So what we want to do here is this books, we want to initialize that with a new hash set. So we'll initialize that property by default, and we'll do the same on book. Now what we can do is say Eric get books, and we're going to add like so. And then also on the books object, we want to get the authors and add Eric as an author of that book. And then finally, what we can do is save both of those into our repository. So we want to say author repository, save, Eric, and then book repository, save. So that's going to save those into the H2 database. Now let's also do one more example of this. We'll add in an author, and we'll call this Rod. So we're adding in Rod Johnson here. And Rod Johnson is the founder of the Spring Framework. So we'll call it this book, No EJB. This is another iconic book. And this is the old J2EE. And it still scares me that that was changed over a decade ago from J2EE to JEE. And companies are still looking for J2EE developers. I'm just adding in a random value for this, but I'm not going to actually look that up. And now what we want to say is do the same thing here, Rod, get books. We're going to add in no EJB. And then also we'll take the no EJB, get authors, and we'll add Rod as an author to that. And then finally, let's do this. And I'm also going to do so I'm going to output a count there. So now if I come in here, and what I can do is go to the Spring application, and I'm going to start that up, and we should see console output that says the number of books that have been loaded into the database. So you can see here Spring is initializing. And you can see started in Bootstrap, number of books 1. So what did we do wrong there? I'm not sure if you see it, but I see it right away there. I forgot to save Rod. It's going to helps quite a bit if we actually go in and save the data that we're expecting. So let me go ahead and restart this, and I bet the number of books will increment to 2 this time when we restart our little Spring Boot application here. There we go. That is much better. So you can see down on the bottom of the screen, I now have number books 2. So let me minimize the console. Just to recap what we did here on line 13, I'm saying using this component annotation to tell the Spring Framework that this is a Spring managed component, and I'm implementing the interface command line runner, which has the one method that we have to bring in, which is the run method, which takes a string of arguments, which we're not using at all. But the Spring managed component, we are saying that it's got 2 properties, the author repository and the book repository, and they are final variables. So we're initializing those inside the constructor, which tells the Spring Framework to, when it constructs this bean, that it has to inject an instance of author repository and book repository. So when it starts up, the run method, this bean is configured by the Spring Framework. And then what we are doing is we are creating 2 author objects and 2 book objects, and we are using the repository methods to save them. And underneath the covers, Spring Data JPA is utilizing Hibernate to save these to an in-memory H2 database. I have an assignment for you, and that is to add in a publisher entity. So what I want you to do is create a new POJO for a publisher, and this publisher should have a name of the publisher, address line 1, city, state, and zip, so some basic address properties. If the address in your locale is different than that, use a set of properties that make sense for you. And then want you to annotate that publisher class as an entity. So make that a JPA entity, which means you're going to have to set up that ID property as well. And then as we did previously, go ahead and override equals hashcode and toString, then add in a repository for this. And then in the Bootstrap class, go ahead and create a new publisher, call it whatever you want, save it, and verify the output like I showed you previously. So just a simple system out and get a publisher is perfectly fine. We don't need to do anything elaborate here. We're just starting to kick the tires and learn things here as we go forward. And if you have any questions at all, Don't worry, I am going to live code this assignment and go through it step by step in the next video. I'm going to go ahead and complete the assignment now, and that was to add in a publisher entity. So let's come in here, and I am going to create a new Java class. We'll call that publisher. And we wanted that to have a name. And we said address line 1, like so. So we add in city, state, and zip. So that sets up our basic publisher. Now we want to come in here and start annotating this as a JPA entity. So we'll come up here and add it in as an entity. Set up the ID value like so. And then remember, we need to annotate that as an ID. And then we need to tell Hibernate about how it's being persisted. So this is where we use that generated value. And we are going to tell Hibernate that the strategy is generation type of auto, meaning that the underlying database is going to handle that. So now this sets up the basic properties of the class. So now let's use IntelliJ to help us out. First, let's set up a constructor. JPA does require a no args constructor. And then also let's go in and add in getters and setters for everything. So we'll add in getters and setters for all properties. And I'm not going to scroll down and review those, but keep the screen up here in the middle. I normally add these down to the bottom, but let's go ahead and add in equals and hash code. And I'm going to take in the IntelliJ default template. And here, I just want the ID property to determine equality and also in hash code. And we'll go ahead and add those in so that sets up equals and hash code. And then also, let's come in and set up our toString method. And we'll take in all the properties for our toString method. So that completes the POJO, or creating the POJO and annotating it as a JPA entity. You can see the properties that I added, annotated as an entity, gave it an ID value, then also a generated value, overrode the toString method, overrode the equals hash code, and then down here at the bottom you can see the getters and setters that I generated using IntelliJ. So the next thing we need to do is come in here and create a repository for it. Publisher repository, we'll add that in, and we will use the same CRUD repository, and that will be publisher, and the key on that is long, and I made a mistake there. That should be interface, easy enough to fix. So now that creates our, that should be extends, my mistake, going a little too fast here. So interface, publisher repository extends out the CRUD repository interface, so that sets up our Spring component through Spring Data JPA. This initializes that, and then the last piece that we wanted to do was create a publisher. So I'm going to come into Bootstrap Data, and up here, private final, publisher repository like so. And what I found is, this is just my own work habit here. So if I got 3 properties like this, rather than typing and modifying the existing constructor, I'll just come in, delete it, and then do Command N, constructor, allow it to take all the properties. And now that gets set up. And what we wanted to do is add in a new publisher. So I'm going to say publisher. Remember, I didn't set up a constructor for that, so let's do publisher. So SFG publishing. Be in St. Petersburg. Good old St. Pete, Florida. I'm not going to complete all the properties, so we'll just do publisher repository. Save. And we'll do the publisher like so. And then we said we wanted to do a verification. So let's do a verification step there. So I'll just do S out. So you can see the shortcut that IntelliJ is providing me. I just hit enter and let's move this one up a little bit. So that should give us some interesting output. So now I'm going to come up here. You can see that I've already ran the application. Just in case I went through that a little too quick before, if I come in here to the Spring Data web application and just click on the right arrow here and say run this, this is going to tell IntelliJ to go ahead and start this up. It's running the main class, bringing up Spring, initializing Spring. And we can see here that we started up in Bootstrap, and I got a publisher count of 1 and 2 books, which is exactly what I wanted. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this, and we'll minimize that panel. And just to recap what we did is I added in a new POJO for publisher. So publisher is annotated as an entity with the ID and generated value. So saying that the ID property is being managed by the underlying database. Gave it the properties, added in a no-args constructor, toString equals and hash code have been overridden for the ID property, which is exactly what we want. Then we set up getters and setters for all the properties. We added in a new repository, publisher repository, that extends out the Spring Data JPA CRUD repository. And then finally, in Bootstrap Data, we went in and we added in a new property for a publisher repository, modified the constructor to tell Spring Framework that we want an instance of that injected into this class using dependency injection. And then we created a new publisher object, saved it to the repository. And then on line 40 there, you can see I'm doing a system out print line to get a count. And this is actually going against the H2 in-memory database and getting a count out and displaying it to the console. Okay, we've gone in and we added in a publisher entity, but we didn't do any further mapping for that. So we do have a publisher entity, but it's not related to anything. In a logical sense, a publisher is probably going to be publishing many books, and a book typically is only going to have one publisher. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up the JPA relationships for that. I'm just going to step through this to get our feet wet with these relationships. This is a pretty common situation. So our publisher is going to have a set of books, and our book is going to have a publisher property. And I'm going to jump over to IntelliJ, modify the classes to show this relationship, and then show you the JPA annotations that we use to tell Hibernate how these are related. And don't worry, I'm going to go through this a little bit quick. I have a whole section on mapping where I dive into these mappings a lot deeper. Here we are just setting up a really fundamental data model and getting accustomed to JPA a little bit before we move on with building our Spring Framework web application. So let's go ahead and start doing the mapping to configure publisher to have a set of books. So I'm going to come in here and let's do private set. We'll say books. We'll call it books. Like so. And then also one thing that we want to do is when we're working with sets like this, we want to initialize it. And there's a couple different ways to do this, but the easiest is to just say new hash set to default it to an empty hash set. That is by far the simplest technique here of setting that up. If you do not, this can really catch you, because if you forget to initialize it at runtime, that books property hasn't been initiated at all, and you will get a infamous NPE error. So that takes care of the publisher mapping. Now let's come over to the book and also set up a book publisher there. So that sets him up, and let's go in and also add in getters and setters for that. So that initializes that. And on the publisher, I forgot to add in the getters and setters. And I normally do this all together, but for clarity, I'm just going to add the getters and setters right here. So that takes care of the Java side. So now we need to address the other side as far as the JPA mapping. So here on the publisher, what we want to do is annotate that property, and we are going to say at one-to-many. So one-to-many meaning that the publisher is one and it has many books. Now on the book side, we are going to do just the opposite. And here, what we are going to say, many to one. So that is the opposite. So that is the inverse, meaning that there's many publishers, but it's only coming to this one entity. So here's many to one, and then one to many. Now, one other thing that we need to do here is we want to say a join column, and we are going to give Hibernate a hint to use a join column called. So here we are saying publisher ID, and IntelliJ is doing a little red squiggly under there because I haven't configured a data source. So it's trying to look at a database and it's not finding it. So it's giving me a warning there that it's not finding that, which is perfectly okay. But what this is doing is giving Hibernate a hint to add in a publisher ID to the book record to track the publisher. So that's going to create a foreign key relationship underneath the covers for us. So pretty elegant little mapping here. So we don't need any type of join table or anything like that. Very simple mapping to set that up. So now the last thing that we want to do is come in here and initialize some bootstrap data. So let's come over here. Remember, we're already creating a publisher. Now what we want to do is go in and add in that publisher. So we can say for DDD, set the publisher to our publisher. And then also on our publisher, we can get books and add in the DDD book, Domain Driven Design by Eric. And here we actually want to go ahead and save that too, because now that entity is changing. So we'll say publish repository. We'll save the publisher. Let's do the same thing for the no EJB book. And then finally, we'll say publisher repository. And here, let's go ahead and I'm going to do a sys out. And we'll say, so we'll just display the number of books assigned to a publisher. And if I wanted to get fancy, I could go and actually retrieve this out of the database, but I think this is good enough for our purposes. We'll just say publisher get books.size, like so. And let's come up here to the Spring web application. So this is the main class. I'm just going to click the run here to initialize that. And again, what's happening is Spring is initializing. It's going to bring up Hibernate. Hibernate's going to see our JPA configuration, creates our database. The Bootstrap class runs. And you can see here, we started in Bootstrap, one publisher, 2 books, and the publisher has 2 books. So just exactly as we expected. So I'm going to shut this down and do a quick recap here. So on publisher, we are doing a one-to-many, meaning that one publisher has many books, and we are doing a set of books. And the join column is giving Hibernate a hint that on the books, we are going to have publisher ID to reference back to what publisher it has. And so we just added in the books property, and then getters and setters for the books. And then on the book entity, we did use the opposite annotation, many publishers to one book. So we have a publisher property, a singular property, and we use the many to one annotation and then provided getters and setters for that. And then finally in Bootstrap data, we initialize the publisher and save that relationship. And we can see on the final line 67 there, where we're doing the output to prove that the publisher does have 2 books assigned to it. So that completes the mapping of publisher to books. You can see it probably does get a little confusing. I'm sure it does first time going through it. I still have to go back and carefully think through when I'm doing these JPA mappings, because there's a lot of stuff that's going on. But if you've been following along, one thing that has not been happening, if you notice, we haven't written any SQL at all. We didn't develop any SQL. What's happening underneath the covers, I don't think I pointed this out before, is Hibernate is actually generating the SQL DDL statements to go out and create the database tables based on our JPA definition. So this is all happening transparently, and there are settings for that. And this is stuff that we'll explain further into the course. But just wanted you to think, now that we're literally coming up, we are creating entities. Those are getting persisted to an actual in-memory H2 database. But initialization, if you look at the logs, you'll see Hibernate is actually initializing the database. It's generating the SQL statements based on the entities that we've created. And then when we populate these entities and say save, Hibernate's going in and creating the SQL statements to insert the data for us. So it really does alleviate a lot of stuff that we have to do, especially as far as creating tables, maintaining those tables, doing all the SQL statements, because I've written plenty of pure SQL JDBC stuff, and it is very, very verbose. So I want to take a moment to point out to you what we are not writing by using Hibernate and Spring Data JPA. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to utilize the H2 database console. So first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and start the application. So I'm just going to click here and run the Spring Boot web application. And we can see that it starts up fairly quickly. So we are up and running. And we can see here in the console output that Tomcat has started on port 8080. Now I'm going to toggle over to Chrome. And here you can see localhost 8080, so that's where Tomcat is listening. And if you go to the URL h2-console, that is where the database console is. And you can see here I'm getting a white label error page. This is the standard Spring Boot error page. And we're seeing that we're getting a not found status 404, which is expected at this point. Now, if I come back over here to IntelliJ, what I need to do is stop Spring Boot, come in here to Application Properties, and I'm just going to type H2, and you can see that we do have several settings. The H2 console enable is defaults to false. There was a period in time where Spring Boot was enabling that by default, true, but they made a change at some, I forget what release it was, but that is now set to false, and there's a couple other settings that we can adjust in here. Not going to get into those at this point, but the primary thing is we want to take this, enable it, and set it to true. And then we do need to restart Spring Boot. So I stopped it. I'm just going to start it again for the setting to take effect. And now we can see that we are up and running again. And taking a look at the console output here, we can see here that we do have output. So we're saying that it's available at H2 console, and this here database available at this JDBC URL. This is very important. So it's at JDBC:H2:MEM. That means an in-memory database, and the schema name is going to be testDB. So this is very important to set up. Like toggle over to Chrome now. I'm just going to do a refresh since I already had that URL, and here you can see that we have a login page, defaults to username SA, password of null. But what you want to watch out for here is this JDBC URL. Make sure that matches what we had before, because what chances are, if you are running this for the first time, you might get something different there. So definitely watch this. I see people have a lot of problems with this as far as having that, because what happens if you have a different database string in there, different connect string, the way H2 works, it's just going to create the database for you in memory, and you're not going to see any of the tables. So this is a very important piece right here. So all I'm going to do is click on Connect. And now we can see the database that has been created by Hibernate. So Hibernate is defaulting into a create mode, so it's looking at our JPA entities and running the necessary SQL statements to create our database tables. So now if I just come over here to Publisher, I clicked on Publisher, I'm going to run that, and here we can see the properties that I set up there for that. So if I clear this, we can also go to Author and run that, and we can see we got Eric Evans and Rod Johnson that have been created in the author table. And if I clear this, come over to Book, run that, we can see the table that was created for the book. So we are, in fact, loading data into in-memory database. And this H2 console is a very handy tool to use, especially when you're developing. If you're going through and altering your domain objects, you can get feedback pretty quick about what's going on in the database. So this also helps you with debugging. So if you have something odd happening, sometimes it's important to go look at the database and see what's really going on. So just to recap, I'm going to toggle back over to IntelliJ. To enable this, all you need to do is add this line, spring.h2.console.enabled equal true. And then you'll see this console auto configuration here. This is very important. So the URL is going to be by default h2-console. And then the database connect string, this JDBC h2 mem testdb. So that is where you go. And chances are the first time you're running that, there's a good chance that the JDBC connect URL will be different. And if you connect, you're not going to see any of the tables or any of the data that's been created into the in-memory database that Spring Boot is using. Okay, Spring uses a model called MVC, and that stands for Model View Controller. So this is a very, very common design pattern. It actually dates back to the 70s, where I think it was a Xerox engineer created it, and later the Smalltalk community, just back in probably the 80s, started picking up on it. And it's been adapted widely since then. And this is not a Spring-specific technology by any means. It's widely used in .NET, Ruby on Rails, and a lot of applications use this, and a lot of GUI applications use this. So traditional client-server type stuff used it. And it's definitely not a new paradigm at all, but the reason it is so successful is it does a great job of separating out concerns. So what I want to do is step through how it works. And in a conceptual level, a client, whether it's a web application or a mobile application or some type of device like a client-server application, makes a request, and that request comes into the controller. And in our instance, it's going to be over HTTP. And that controller determines how to get the model. So it's going to go out and get the model and then return that model to the view. And this is a true separation of concerns, because that model that's returned shouldn't have business logic in it. Ideally, that should be plain old Java object if we're in the Java world, so it should just be a data structure. The controller should be a traffic cop. He should be deciding how to get the model and who to ask the model from, and that should be it. I've seen a lot of bad code out there where the controller is overloaded with a lot of stuff in it. I mean, I've seen like database connections get done in controllers, which is just awful. A very, very bad programming practice. So keep the controller light. It should be just a traffic cop. And then the controller is going to return the model to a view component. Now that view component, his purpose in life is to render the view for the client. So in our case, we're going to be using Thymeleaf, a templating engine. Thymeleaf is going to take the model, a POJO, and look at our template and generate the HTML to return back to the client. So this all works transparently, and it works out well because everything's separated. I've seen instances where people try to put in static method calls inside the view layer that call to the database. And that systems like that, where things aren't separated, become just a nightmare to deal with. Now, let's take a look at this in a Spring context. So this is how Spring MVC models it, and getting a little detail of what happens under the covers. So we get a client request come in, and that could be typically HTTP, and it could be for a web page, or it could be a REST service call. So I'm not going to get into the details of that at this point, but it goes to a dispatcher servlet. So this is the classic Java servlet architecture. So we get that web request comes in, and it decides how to handle it. And it refers to the handler mapping, because you're going to go to a specific path and you're making a request from the server. So now it goes, okay, well, where do I go for this? And it determines that. It determines the controller to utilize the controller method. Now, the controller typically in a Spring application is going to have some type of service layer wired up to it. And that service layer is going to get the data and return it back to the controller. And then the controller is going to take that data, the model, which is just a simple POJO, return it back to the dispatcher servlet. And in this case, the dispatcher servlet knows what it wants to do for the view. It could be a REST call, and we need to return back XML or JSON, or it could be for HTTP or HTML. And in that case, we're going to invoke a view technology to render the HTML, such as JSP, Velocity, or Thymeleaf. And in the upcoming example, I'm going to show you the Thymeleaf example. So this is pretty simple, but it's high level. It's important to realize what's happening here with this request. So again, just to go through it at a high level, request comes in, dispatcher servlet looks up the handler mapping, invokes the controller method, which in a Spring context is going to go call a service, get the data, return the model, and then the model is going to get passed off to a templating engine for us, in this case Thymeleaf, and then that HTML is going to get rendered back to the client. Now in this module, we're going to introduce you to configuring Spring controllers. What we need to do is associate a controller method with a request path. Thus, when Spring gets a request on a specific path, a specific controller method will get invoked. Now in our example, what we want the controller to do is go to the database, get a list of books, and return it over to the view. Now to configure a controller in Spring, we're going to annotate the class with the @controller annotation. This will tell Spring to manage that class as a Spring being and that it is a Spring MVC controller. Now to set up the request path, we are going to use the annotation request mapping to tell Spring to associate a path with a controller method. In this module, we are just going to look at configuring the controller to return data to the view. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the actual view layer. So I'm going to jump over to IntelliJ now and show you how to wire up a Spring controller. So the first thing I want to do when I'm adding a controller, I like to add a package for controllers. I've seen some Spring projects where they get a little scattered and it's confusing to people coming in. So I like to create a new package and just call it controllers, like so. And then a nice naming convention is to just do book controller. So that tells you the purpose and life of this class. And we will add that to GitHub. And what we want to do here is let's do public string, and we'll just do get books. And what we want this to do is return back. This is going to be the view name, so we're going to say books, and we'll configure this in the actual view in the next video. So this is a very simple method. And now let's start adapting this to actually be an actual controller within the terms of the Spring framework. So I'm going to come up here and let's annotate it with the controller. This is a Spring stereotype, which tells the Spring framework our intent is to make this into a Spring MVC controller. Now we want to map this to a specific URL, and the way we do that is we're going to use the request mapping annotation. So we're going to say request mapping, and we just need to give it the path. So we're just going to do /books. So when we do an action against the URL of books, this method is going to get invoked by the Spring MVC framework. Now what we want to do here is pass in the model. Remember, Spring MVC model view controller. So we have the controller and we want to bring in the model. And we'll just call that model. So this gives us the model object, and keep in mind, this is what is going to get returned to the view. So the view is going to get a copy of the model. Now we want to enhance that model with a list of books. So to do so, what we want to do is come in here. Let's do private final. So we want to bring in an instance of the book repository. So what we're asking the Spring framework to do is inject a book repository. And I'm going to generate a constructor, command N to bring that up. And Now, because I have a constructor on that, and this is a Spring managed component because it is a controller, when Spring instantiates this, it will inject an instance of that book repository into our controller. Now, what we can do here is grab our model, and we're going to do an add attribute. We just want attribute. So we're going to use this here, attribute name and attribute value. And we'll just simply call that books. Now we're going to say our book repository, and we're just going to simply say find all. So now what this is going to do is at runtime, when Spring gets a request to the URL /books, it is going to execute the getBooks method, and it's going to provide that method a model object. And our code is saying for that model, we are going to add the attribute called books, and we're going to get execute book repository, which is going to give us a list of books. Now this model is going to get returned back to our view layer, and it's going to have an attribute books and a list of books on that, and then we'll be able to utilize that value inside of our view layer to apply the necessary view that we're going to be returning back to the client. So to just quickly recap what we did here is we added a new package called controllers, created a new class called book controller, and we annotated that class right at the class level with the Spring stereotype of controller. We are injecting in, using Spring's dependency injection, we are injecting in an instance of the book repository, and we set up on line 20 there a request mapping for /books. So it's going to execute the getBooks method. Spring is going to provide in a model, and we are using the repository to get a list of books out of the database, assign it to the attribute of books on the model, and then we are returning back a string called books, and that is going to tell Spring MVC we want to apply the view books, and the books component, the view component, is what we're going to address in the next video. Now what you saw me create there was a very simple Spring MVC controller. This is about as simple as they come. Now going forward in the course, we are going to get into Spring MVC a lot more in depth. I'm just going through a very simple example here to get your feet wet with Spring MVC. So further down in the course, we're definitely going to explore Spring controllers more because there's a lot more to them. But for now, this is just a very simple example. All we want to do is display a list of books on the web page. And in the next video, we're going to show you the view technology so we can get that web page displayed. Okay, now as a Java developer, you have several templating technologies to choose from. Now, if you're not familiar with templates, it's the technology we use to generate dynamic HTML, like when we're pulling something out of a database and want to put it on a web page. In this lecture, I'm going to introduce you to Thymeleaf. Now, I want to point out that it is pronounced Thymeleaf, not Thymeleaf. When I first started using Thymeleaf, I was mistakenly calling it Thymeleaf. And you can go out to YouTube on my channel, and I do have an early video where I was calling it Thymeleaf in the video, and somebody called me out on it. So it happens. Now, Thymeleaf is a Java template engine. It's an alternative to Java server pages. And there's actually a number of alternatives to JSPs we can choose from. And I'm guessing it's because JSPs are just so awful to work with. I haven't used JSPs forever, so I hate them. The first stable release of Thymeleaf came out in 2011. The current release is on version 3, which includes some very cool features for reactive springs in Spring 5. Now, Thymeleaf is known as a natural template engine, meaning you can view the templates naturally in your browser. In this module, we're going to take a quick look at running a simple HTML page to show a list of books. We're only doing a quick introduction to Thymeleaf in this video. There's a lot more to it. I actually have a whole course on Thymeleaf. And we're going to see a lot more of Thymeleaf in this course, but like some of the new reactive programming stuff in Spring 5, I'm kind of excited to get to that personally. But for now, that's a whole different subject. I'm going to jump over to IntelliJ, and we're going to take a look at our first Thymeleaf template. Okay, in this video, we are going to get Thymeleaf cooking. And the first thing that we need to do is bring in the Spring Boot starter for Thymeleaf. Now, this is very important. If you do not do this step, this will not work. So things will definitely not work if you do not bring in the starter. So you can see here on the screen on line 33, I've added in the Maven dependency for the Spring Boot starter for Thymeleaf. And let's come over to the Maven window and take a quick look at that. Let me expand this out a little bit. So you can see here, that's the Spring Boot starter for Thymeleaf. And It's emitting the Spring Boot starter, but it's also bringing in the Thymeleaf jar for Spring, and then Thymeleaf extras, which includes some Java 8 time. So again, this is the curated dependency for Thymeleaf from the Spring Boot folks to bring in the Thymeleaf dependency, so it takes all the thought out of what we need to do. So let's go ahead and I'm going to resize this and collapse it. So let's come over here to templates. So by default, Spring Boot is going to look under templates for Thymeleaf templates. I've set up a directory called books and list HTML. And this list HTML, this is the view that I want to render for a books list. Right now, this is just a simple HTML document, nothing Thymeleaf about it. I'm going to add that in this video. I'm just saving us a little time. I don't think you guys want to sit here and watch me type out this entire HTML document, but you can see just standard HTML, nothing particularly earth-shattering here. Let's toggle over to Chrome real quick. And here is that list. This is that HTML document, the books.html. And you can see it's just simple book list. It's got a couple of HTML elements, and then I am showing one thing in the list. So very simple HTML document. We're not doing any styling or anything like that at this point. So let's jump back over to IntelliJ, and I am going to start making this into a Thymeleaf document. Now remember, HTML is a subset of XML. And what I want to do is come up here and I'm going to paste something in off my clipboard. And this is the Thymeleaf namespace. So what I'm doing is I'm adding in the tag th, and it's going to reference the Thymeleaf namespace. So that's going to give me Thymeleaf extensions to this XML document. And that's how Thymeleaf is going to work. It's going to work through attributes out of that XML namespace, which tells Thymeleaf to do stuff. So there's a number of things that Thymeleaf does. We will be getting into a lot of the features of Thymeleaf coming up in the course. We are just going to look at setting up a very simple thing here. And what we want to do is under our table row here for the content, we are going to do a Thymeleaf iterator. And what we want to do is Thymeleaf each. So that sets up an each iterator. And we're going to say for book, colon, and here I want to get that books attribute from the model. So I'm going to say books. So this is how we are asking the model to give us the property of books. And this is syntax for Thymeleaf to say, I want an iterator over books. Now, the next thing we want to do is come down here to these elements. And what's going to happen is for each book, Thymeleaf is going to render this element. So it's going to iterate through and render that element for each book that it finds in the list of books that we added to the model. So now what we want to do is tell Thymeleaf to replace these elements. So I'm going to say Thymeleaf text. And here I want to tell it the property that I want. So I'm going to do $ squiggly. Don't know what those brackets are called officially. And I'm going to say book ID. And let me just copy this. Let's speed things up a little bit. And I'm going to come here. Paste that, and I want the book title. Then finally, we want to show the publisher name. And here, remember, publisher is an object that is on the book object. So we want to say, and we are going to navigate that object graph through the dot notation. And we'll say name, like so. Now, there's one other change that we need to make here to the code. And right now, IntelliJ is flagging this because it doesn't understand what that property is. We haven't told it about it. There's some things that we can tell IntelliJ, but we'll get to that in a future video. So don't worry about IntelliJ flagging this. It just doesn't know what that book property is. Now, we do need to make one change to the book controller because right now we are returning back to books. And actually, we want to tell it books list. So that is going to tell it to look for the list template inside the directory books. Now let's go ahead. I think that does everything. So let's go ahead and start this up. So we can see that we are up and running on port 8080. I'm going to toggle over to Chrome. And here's localhost books. Let's resolve that. And we can see here we are getting our book list, the ID properties. So remember, these are the two objects that we had in the database. domain-driven design, and J2EE development without EJB from the publisher SFG Publishing. So that is the values that we are having outside or from the database. So let me come in here and take a look at the view page source. And we can see here, these are the elements that Thymeleaf generated dynamically. So we had 2 objects in that list that we are returning back to the view layer. Thymeleaf went over that list, iterated it, and created these elements. So if I come back over to IntelliJ and take a look at that list, we can see that this element was created for every item in the books list. Now, there is one thing that I do want to point out. We made a small mistake here. We are getting into circular reference, and right now if we run our toString method, we will get unhappiness through a circular reference. So we want to remove this books property from our toString method, because if that runs right now, that will get into an infinite loop. And we also want to remove authors from that property. So that is something I found, a mistake that we made in our testing. And I think publisher is okay. So we're not iterating over the books property. Sometimes when you get into circular reference on a toString method, you got to be careful. That can be problematic, and it's very, very easy mistake to make. So just to recap what we covered in this lesson, first thing was to add in the Thymeleaf starter. Very important. If you are following along and you forget this, I guarantee it will not work because your project knows nothing about Thymeleaf. And underneath the covers, Spring Boot is doing configuration to support the Thymeleaf template engine, because once you add that dependency on the class path, Spring Boot will perform the auto configuration magic to make it work for you and apply sensible defaults. So if you miss that, absolutely will not work. Next thing was we added in this list, HTML. So we added in this HTML document, and we converted it to be a Thymeleaf template. So remember, Thymeleaf is a natural templating engine, works from an HTML document via the Thymeleaf namespace. So the TH:, those are Thymeleaf directives to tell Thymeleaf how to render this document. And then finally, because we put this under templates, books, list HTML, we made a small change to our controller, and we are telling it to return back books list. So that's going to tell the view resolver to look for a template under the directory books called list. And you don't have to say list HTML, just list is perfectly fine. Actually, I think it might break it if you do list.html, so you definitely want to be doing that. And that is how the view resolver finds the Thymeleaf template to render the HTML to our client. All right, so that is a quick introduction to Thymeleaf. So you can see how nice it is to work with. When you have a natural template engine, you can do your development on HTML and toggle over and see your changes right away inside the browser. And you saw what a clean language it is too. We only went in about this deep onto Thymeleaf and its capabilities, but as a quick example, I was able to take an object out of the database using Spring Data JPA, run it through Spring MVC to the Thymeleaf view layer where we had a list of POJOs, and we rendered that list on a web page. So, and you can see it. Once we got this down, it's a pretty seamless process to develop web applications using the Spring framework. In this video, I have an assignment for you, and that is to display the list of authors. So I want you to recreate what we've done so far for the books and do the same thing for authors. So what you need to do is go out and create an author controller, and we want to inject the author repository via the constructor into the controller so we can utilize that repository. And then we want to create a method on that controller to handle the request for viewing authors at the URL of /authors. And then, of course, we're going to have to provide the view. So in the templates folder, we want to create a directory called authors and then add in a list.html, and the controller should return back authors/list. And then in that, we need to set up that Thymeleaf template to display a list of authors. So almost cookie cutter for what we did for books, but I want you to do the hands-on and apply what you've learned in the last few lessons and set that up for the so that we can display authors out of the database. And then if you have any questions at all, don't worry. In the next video, I will have a complete hands-on live code, and we will step through this assignment so that you can see everything done step by step. In this video, we are going to go ahead and complete the assignment, and that is to set up a view for a list of authors. So the first thing I want to do is come in, and I'm going to come in and add the authors controller. So this is just going to be a simple Java class. And I'm going to just start from the top to bottom. We'll say controller, and this is going to need a instance of the authors repository. So I'm going to say private final author repository, like so. Command N, create constructor. Now I'm going to say public string, and this is going to take in the model. Now this is going to be request mapping, and we want to bind this to authors like so. Now the model, we want to add an attribute, and that is going to be authors, and we're going to take just a list from the, or an iterable from the repository like so, and we want to return back the string authors/list. So that sets up the mapping to the view resolver. And now what we want to do is come under here and see here. I'll create a new directory. And I just took out that compact middle packages. So I am just going to copy this view and paste that right into authors. And always be careful when we're doing cut and paste operations. So now we have, I'm going to say author list. And let's see here, we want some properties from that. So let's come up here to the domain authors. So we had just first and last name. So what we can do is ID stays the same. Say first. First name, last name. So that's perfectly fine. Now this is going to change to authors. And this will be an author. That becomes that. And we will say Joe, and this is going to become an author as well. First name, last name, and we'll just say Joe Smith. And I think that should do everything. So the list controller. So let's go ahead, and I was already running here from the previous lesson. So what I need to do here is restart it. That will allow Spring Boot to pick up the changes. Now that there is a project called Spring Boot Developer Tools, and I will cover that at a future point in the course. So we are back started. Let's toggle over to Chrome and see if I got everything working. Hey, worked on the first try. Sometimes I get worried when things work on the first try like this. So there's the author list. I am pulling these two records out of the database for Eric Evans and Rod Johnson. And just to jump back over to IntelliJ, let's do a quick review. I minimize this and minimize domain. So what I did in this assignment review is I added in the author controller. So this is annotated as a controller, the Spring stereotype of controller, which tells Spring that this is a Spring component. Because it is a Spring component and I've given it a constructor for the author repository, Spring is going to use dependency injection to inject an instance of that into this class. Then on line 20 there, I'm saying use request mapping to map request to the URL of authors, or that path. And for that, I'm asking Spring MVC to inject in an instance of the model when that is called. I'm taking that model, I'm adding an attribute of it called authors. I'm just getting an iterable from the author repository, which is just going to give me everything in the database. And then I'm returning back the view, the identifier for the view, which is authors list. And that is going to, by default, Spring Boot is configuring Thymeleaf to look at the templates directory. And within the templates directory, I'm going to look under the path of authors and then for a view called list. So then I added in the list HTML, which you can see here. Really, you saw me copy that over from the books and then modify it. So always be careful when you do cut and paste like that. You can burn yourself pretty easily. But in this case, it was very similar to exactly what we were doing. I updated the properties to display the author's ID, first name, and last name. Okay, this concludes the video tutorial on creating a Spring Boot web application. I hope you really enjoyed this course and got a lot of value out of this video. If you did, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and like this video. Leave me a comment below if you really liked the video. I'd appreciate that. And if you do want to learn more about Spring Framework, check out my courses on Udemy. I do have a number of different courses where I take you into a much deeper dive on how to use the Spring Framework to build applications.